Cuba, April 1961. The sea looks polished and the air tastes of salt and diesel. Along coastal roads, workers cycle past warehouses, eyes down as if routine can soften rumor. Across the water, in offices lit late into the night, maps lie open under desk lamps. Notes are folded into jackets before each door clicks shut. The official line suggests a short operation with clear horizons. It promises a return to order and the end of a problem that has lingered since the island's last great upheaval. Yet the tone in private seems less certain. Some lines on the map do not quite agree. Some estimates were copied from earlier drafts. A few voices caution that local sentiment may be harder to read than assumed. This program presents a speculative reconstruction grounded in widely cited histories, public archives, and period reporting. It does not claim total knowledge. Names of specific devices and detailed methods are intentionally avoided. Where events appear contested, we use cautious language and keep to the tempo of 1961. Our aim is to follow the trace left by meeting agendas, brief press statements, and field notes that reached official desks. In these pages, the story moves carefully from quiet preparation to a shoreline that does not behave as planned. Nothing settles into a final verdict. Seen from the sea, the chosen inlet looks small. Seen from the capital, the threat looks large. Between those views lies the gamble. We proceed as if walking a dim hallway, guided by what the record suggests and by what it leaves uncertain. The months before the landing formed a narrow corridor of choices. Those choices began with a conviction that the island's ruling circle stood on contested ground, and that pressure applied with care might fracture it. Exiles gathered beyond the public eye, carrying habits from earlier lives into a new routine of marches, schedules, and short briefings. The talk was spare and practical. Return soon, a welcome waiting, a path through the capital that would open once the first steps landed on the strand. In offices far from the surf, planners reviewed typed pages and penciled corrections. The words looked clean. Their certainty rested on a belief that fatigue with the government had grown faster than the government's grip. It also rested on a promise of help at crucial moments. That promise moved along hallways without always hardening into a dated order. Those who believed most strongly in a swift outcome did so because the plan seemed to fit the mood they thought they saw. They pictured crowds peeling away from the state at the first sign of a new banner and officials pausing long enough for the balance to tilt. The caution came from quieter corners. A few analysts noted that state networks had rebuilt faster than expected. They suspected that discipline inside the capital had tightened since the last serious test. The file suggested a society alert to external pressure and a leadership ready to use that alertness as proof of unity. Two items reinforced the tension between hope and doubt. One was a short agenda from a late meeting that flagged unresolved concerns about local support in several towns. The other was a public statement issued in Havana that warned of attempts at subversion and invited vigilance across neighborhoods. Those two texts did not settle anything. They showed that both sides were prepared to speak a narrative of inevitability. The exiles were told that they would be met by open arms. The government implied that it would meet them with organized resolve and visible calm. In the space between, the internal timeline shortened. A date was penciled, then adjusted, then restored. Ships were loaded in quiet berths. Men read small prayer cards or traced a simple habit learned at home, then folded those motions back into their pockets. Intelligence reports carried mixed signals. One line called rural sentiment fertile terrain for a change. Another line, written with restraint, suggested loyalty to the new order ran steadier in cities than many thought. The document trail made it clear that many actors accepted some uncertainty as the price of momentum. If a calculation felt heavy, it was rounded off with faith in speed and surprise. The tone in Washington, as described later, wavered between guarded and firm. The tone in Havana, as carried by radio, sounded structured and confident. That difference mattered. It framed what would count as success and what would be called proof that the tide had turned. In reality, both narratives sat on fragile supports. A plan built on assumptions required those assumptions to survive contact with the shore. A state built on vigilance needed that vigilance to convert into action across scattered points. On the eve of movement, the coast was ordinary, almost dull. Fishermen checked their lines. A bus rattled past a sugar mill. A sentry watched a gate and stamped his feet against the night. In the distance, a convoy edged toward its mark. The hum of engines kept low, the rhythm of hope and routine blending into something that felt like destiny to some and hazard to others. Men tried to sleep on narrow bunks, eyes closing to the image of a morning road and an easy march inland. A few glanced again at the shoreline sketch pinned over a makeshift table and kept their doubts to themselves. Menjelang malam terakhir sebelum keberangkatan, perhatian bergeser ke meja tempat daftar periksa sudah menunggu, dan setiap nama dipanggil untuk tahap berikutnya. Night travel softened edges and bought a handful of hours, but it could not alter the shape of the inlet that awaited the first craft. The beach lay behind a low line of scrub, with flats that extended farther than maps had suggested, and channels that did not behave like simple arrows pointing inland. The men who stepped down felt the water climb to their waists, then drop, then rise again where the floor shifted. In the dark, training covered much of the fear. Movement stayed compact, voices kept low. The plan required speed before the island could harden its posture. Yet, dawn began to thin the sky earlier than the force needed, and with light came distance, and with distance came exposure. The coastal road, barely more than a strip cut through brush, remained empty at first. Then figures appeared who did not match the image of a waiting crowd. They moved with purpose, but not to welcome. They carried themselves as neighbors on a task, not as a flashpoint for a public display. The invaders looked inland for a signal and saw none. The first exchange of fire came in fits. It showed that the state's alert lines were shorter than hoped. Small patrols grew into more coordinated blocks. What felt like a brief push turned into something that took longer to crack than the schedule allowed. Messages traveled back and forth, hungry for alignment between needs on the sand and approvals far offshore. The phrase "support in place" meant one thing on paper and something else on a tangled shoreline. If reinforcements were staged, they did not appear in the form imagined at planning tables. Some of the men on the beach thought they heard engines where none arrived. Others saw clouds of dust on the road and guessed at numbers that later proved wrong. A field report later noted that communications were intermittent, with requests stacked behind other requests and little harmony between them. A radio log mentioned short bursts of instruction followed by silence, then fragments that repeated old orders. None of this meant chaos, but it created drag. Drag became the heat that warped timelines. The belief that the operation might gather local strength also sagged. People watched from a distance without revealing their leanings. Some may have waited to see which way the wind blew. Others may have seen the state's answer as swift enough to make distance wise. In Havana, a message went out insisting that the defense was firm and calm. It sounded heavier than the situation in the first hour, yet it mattered because it shaped what distant ears believed might be underway. The shift from surprise to stalemate began in small moments. A team pressed forward, met resistance at a bend, then withdrew to cover. Another group tried to cut a path toward a point of control and found the way blocked. Supplies that were supposed to last an interval now felt thin. Water and rations took on weight beyond their size. The air, warming fast, pressed down. The men moved anyway, one position to the next, collecting their own sense of how far inland victory would be. The shoreline that looked like a door now looked like a hold. A few officers tried to redraw the day in their heads. If the first hour had been an hour of luck, the second had become an hour of adjustment. The third could still belong to momentum if momentum could be bought. But every purchase required approvals that sat beyond the edge of the surf. The defenders refined their rhythm. Vehicles appeared. More men took up positions along low rises and near culverts. A coastal community used to routine shifted into a posture that drew lines around the invaders and began to test those lines. The exiles on the ground kept discipline and waited for the promise of help to turn concrete. When help did appear, it arrived in shapes that were narrower than the appetite on the beach. That gap cut into spirits but did not fracture them. The men still believed that the plan could deliver a swing if the hinge could be found. Arguments about that hinge started to grow louder in distant rooms, though those on the sand could not hear them. The idea of expanding the umbrella of support was weighed against the risk of exposure that could not be walked back. Hours passed. The tide rolled its own schedule across tracks, stamped into the sand. A few prisoners were taken on both sides, and with them the first close look at faces that until now had been only shapes against the light. Reports moved, then slowed again. Confidence, while not broken, began to trade at a discount. It was a discount paid in time, and time was the currency the men could not print. Menutup sore yang memar, isyarat itu berlanjut ke ibu kota, di mana siaran berkala dan daftar kebutuhan mulai membentuk babak berikutnya. The capital read the shoreline as a test of messages as much as a test of ground. By late morning, Havana's rhythm had shifted into a pattern that favored control. Public squares showed careful gatherings. Columns in local papers carried brisk language. The state spoke in orderly phrases, the cadence steady, the claim of unity repeated without flourish. Loudspeakers carried updates into courtyards, stairwells, and factory rooms. It was not only theater, it was also a signal to dispersed offices that policy remained aligned and that discipline held. Those signals traveled back to the coast in the form of firmer positions and quicker responses. To outside ears, the broadcast suggested a defense that was already decided. To those watching the tactical map, the issue was still in motion but trending. On the beach, the men who had expected a short push felt the elastic of belief stretch near its limit. They still held ground. They still had leaders who could read the terrain and keep small groups moving with purpose. But each attempt to dip deeper inland ran into better organized resistance. Supply grew tight. Communications, while functional in parts, did not settle into a reliable channel. The horizon that once promised reinforcements began to look like a mirror holding only the same picture hour after hour. Two documents give the mood of this phase its edges. One is a schedule of planned broadcasts from Havana that shows a series of short, confident statements spaced through the day, each designed to frame the narrative and invite vigilance. The other is a set of brief minutes from a crisis committee meeting beyond the island, in which participants weighed the cost of widening support against the risk of a larger confrontation. Neither paper offers a verdict. Together they form the scaffolding for what followed. The exiles maintained pockets of control and pushed when they could. They never stopped looking for a seam in the defense. The state, for its part, tightened the outer ring and began to reduce the beachhead. Prisoners appeared in small groups, the first clear sign that the operation was becoming a matter of endurance measured by hours. Inside Havana, the governing circle used the moment to claim validation. Speeches used language that mixed caution with pride. Posters went up along main routes, adding shape to the message that the island had withstood intrusion. In private, some officials likely admitted that the first shock had been real and that the response had leaned on a reservoir of fear and duty built during earlier struggles. For citizens, the pressure to display loyalty grew noticeable. Workplaces organized brief gatherings. Youth groups were given simple tasks. Neighborhood committees checked lists and passed notes. The city did not exactly celebrate, it braced. Meanwhile, in the rooms where approval for added measures might be given, the discussion stayed tight. Options were presented with neat margins. Each option had a note beside it naming the public face it would wear if taken. Those notes mattered because they showed that the battle on the island was entwined with a battle over story outside it. The idea of a sudden popular swing toward the invaders found little support in new reporting. The belief that opponents of the state would appear in numbers had rested on earlier readings of dissatisfaction that turned out to be too broad. Some people were tired. Many were cautious. Caution can look like loyalty when the ground begins to shake. As day one tilted toward evening, the nature of hope changed. It became hope for relief, not hope for a march to the capital. Relief could take many forms, but the one that mattered required approvals that still flickered. A senior figure asked for clarity. Clarity did not arrive in time. Another official tried to split the problem into smaller parts and move on those without widening the circle. That approach bought a few hours, but it did not change the arc. By the second day, the sand felt heavier. men stood closer together. Positions that looked firm the night before now looked thin in the morning light. It was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow narrowing. Each path forward closed by degrees, and the men felt the close in the way their voices shortened and their glances drifted seaward. Some swam for better cover. Some dug shallow pits with their hands. A few prayed under their breath, then lifted their heads when an order came. Distant allies faced their own reckoning. To escalate would be to cross a line that had been drawn for weeks. To hold back would be to accept attrition in public view. The record suggests a hesitation that came from political caution as much as from operational limits. That hesitation preserved a boundary, and with it the clarity of a later argument. But it also left the men on the beach with fewer cards to play. Inside Havana, the inner circle sensed the shift and prepared to show prisoners, recovered items, and captured notes as proof that an outside hand had been at work. The propaganda value was obvious. The strategic value was that it made wavering citizens firmer. In rural districts, patrols tightened. On the coast, the ring closed further. White flags appeared in some places when ammunition and water ran out. In others, men slipped into the scrub and tried to wait for night. It was a hard pause, not surrender, but the difference narrowed as hours stacked and promises stayed distant. The final shape of the beachhead began to look like a question written on damp paper. By then, many of the original hopes had been replaced by a single urge to extract survivors before the door shut. Toward the edge of the second evening, the capital readied announcements that would claim the matter was resolved. On the shoreline, men still held small corners and scanned the horizon for signs to move. Dari ruang terbatas di garis pantai, fokus berpindah ke jalan pesisir dan pos pemeriksaan berikutnya, saat catatan terakhir disalin untuk tahap selanjutnya. From the roadside, the coast no longer looked like a string of gaps. It looked like a belt cinched tighter each hour. The first checkpoint was little more than a table under a tree, then two more appeared at bends where sand met packed earth, and within a day those tables had turned into nodes with lists and routines. The road carried dust in slow curls, and each truck that passed stirred a brief fog that settled over uniforms and canvas. The men on the beach had hoped to exploit those gaps, slipping inland before patterns formed. Instead, the state consolidated. It used simple measures that did not require heavy tools, only coordination and time. Patrols learned the faces moving along the lanes. Couriers were stopped, questioned, waved on, or held. A note scrawled in the margin of one field report from Coastal Command, likely copied from an original, stated that local committees had marked homes for watch, and that people leaving after curfew would be logged. That note, while small, captured the shift from alarm to procedure. On the shoreline, the invaders adjusted, hugging cover, scanning the water for signals, measuring how far they could move before a horn sounded or a flare rose. They still believed in an opening that would appear if they could stretch the line of contact. Yet every hour made the line stiffer, not looser. Inland, the capital's announcements kept cadence, calm measures, firm resolve, no cause for fear. A midday press bulletin repeated phrases that emphasized order and vigilance. Whether those words matched the heat at specific points mattered less than their effect. They made the defense sound seamless to distant ears, and that sound added weight to decisions being shaped far from the sand. The tide worked its own rhythm, lifting craft and dropping them in slow cycles that did not align with requests. Salt water ate at throats and kept tempers tight. Arguments rose, then cooled at a word from an officer who knew that discipline was the only coin left to spend at scale. Communication scratched in and out. Some batteries held, others failed without fanfare. A team tried to trace a path along a drainage line and found it blocked. Another tried to loop around a low ridge and met an alert that jumped 2 positions in minutes. The conviction that rural districts might support a push did not dissolve entirely, but it weakened under the steady evidence that the state could move faster than earlier estimates allowed. Villagers stood at fences and watched, expressionless, neither inviting nor rejecting. They looked tired, and in tired faces, caution tends to occupy the center. Back in rooms where the broader picture was being weighed, participants kept their voices down and their pencils sharp. The threshold for expanding support remained high. Going past it would trigger a chain that none wished to set off without certainty. Certainty, however, was the one thing the beach could not provide. It had fragments, prisoners taken, positions held, messages sent. Yet the fragments did not assemble into a claim that could outweigh the cost of a wider step. The second afternoon arrived hotter than the first. The sand radiated, water ran low, and was rationed with care that approached ceremony. In some corners, men shared what they had left, leaning on gestures learned in earlier hardships. The defenders, in turn, improved their map. They tested the edges of the beachhead, tugging outward until the fabric pulled. Skirmishes took shape and diffused. A few boats shifted position and drew attention that could not be exploited before the window closed. When aid came, it wore a smaller shape than the need, and its effect was to buy time rather than space. Time helped only if a hinge could be turned while the purchase held. No hinge appeared. The state's ring tightened again, measured in the distance between outposts and the speed of response when a flare rose. Some of the men who had come ashore began to speak less, saving breath and saving judgment. The idea of a march to the capital had already faded into a narrower calculus: hold, preserve, await a decision that might still be forming somewhere beyond hearing. At dusk, a wind shifted and blew smoke inland, reducing visibility and fraying nerves. The checkpoints logged the change and adjusted posture, a routine now embedded in the system. A simple board near a guard post showed more names than the day before. The list included those detained for questioning and those cleared to move supplies toward a separate sector. Even that small record suggested a bureaucracy growing more confident in its grip. The exiles marked the same growth with their own kind of ledger: the number of men fit to move, the number who could still carry a pack, the number who would need a hand if the line broke. None of these entries sounded defeat. They sounded like arithmetic forced by weather, distance, and policy. As night came, the shore pulsed in short bursts of noise, followed by long stretches of listening, each side feeling for the other, each side unwilling to overreach. Toward midnight, a courier reached a staging point with a note confirming that additional measures were being reviewed, but not yet approved. The note was neither cold nor warm. It was exact. Exactness did not lift spirits. It simply clarified that the hours ahead would likely look like the hours just past, unless a new instruction arrived. A few men slept in 10-minute folds. Others stared at the line where black water met black sky, trying to imagine the outline of a craft that might appear if they blinked. Before dawn, an officer walked the perimeter and said nothing. His silence held the shape of a choice that was not his to make. By first light, the checkpoints were awake, and the belt had tightened another notch. And in that narrowing, the next phase took form. As morning broke over the flat water, attention moved from the coastal posts to the improvised command tables where short minutes and clipped signatures would set the tone of the day ahead. The third day did not bring a wave. It brought a ledger. That ledger existed in several places at once. In one corner, a radio log cataloged brief connections, broken phrases, and repeated requests, each line dated and timed, each conclusion tentative. In another, minutes from an emergency meeting outside the island counted options in columns, weighing exposure against restraint with a care that signaled caution more than fear. To the men on the shore, the effect of those papers was simple. Help remained bounded. The boundary was durable because it had been discussed long before anyone stood ankle-deep in surf. The beach did not know those earlier lines by name, but it felt them in the rhythm of responses that arrived thinner than need. Food turned from comfort to calculation. Water turned from relief to ration. Ammunition turned from confidence to clock. The state's side dealt with clocks of its own, yet its clocks ticked inside a growing structure. Local committees sent short reports to district offices. District offices sent summaries up the chain. The capital issued another bulletin in early afternoon, repeating that the situation was under control and crediting the public's cooperation. That message served two purposes. It steadied the home audience and cautioned outside watchers that any expansion would meet a system now fully awake. The invaders still moved with intent. They kept their kit close and their voice low. Leaders adjusted positions by a few dozen yards, not to claim a headline, but to preserve a line that could absorb pressure and return a little of it when the chance appeared. Those chances grew smaller as defensive lines overlapped and turned the beachhead into a shape that could be measured and squeezed. Prisoners began to accumulate on both sides of the line, though the state held more. The first groups were moved inland under guard, and with them went fragments of paper, some hardly more than notes, some detailing schedules that would now become exhibits. Each transfer took another piece of the invaders' privacy and handed it to a narrative machine that had learned its tempo. The exiles heard the change in the way shouts carried across the flats and in the way vehicles moved with fewer pauses between stops. The promise of a local uprising, which had never been more than a projection nested in hope, found little oxygen in the new air. People continued to watch, to whisper, to pass along small observations about fuel, checkpoints, and rumor. Many stayed in place. Staying in place looked like compliance to the patrol and like prudence to the neighbor. It was both. With afternoon heat came fatigue that touched judgment. A few men chose to try for the scrub in small numbers, not as a desertion, but as a play for a better angle. Some succeeded in moving unnoticed. Others met a patrol that had learned the outlines of likely paths. Quiet exchanges at close range replaced ambitions drafted in offices far away. The space for decisive gestures closed, and with it, the illusions that a single spark would rearrange the order of things. Distant backers measured the public face of each path forward and found each lacking. To enlarge the action risked a line that had kept them behind a veil. To hold the line would allow the beachhead to dwindle inside of those who counted reputation by column inches and short broadcasts. Neither choice satisfied. Both had been considered in advance. The papers suggest that the decision to refrain carried the day because refraining kept the map from changing color in ways that could not be reversed. That judgment preserved leverage elsewhere. It also conceded the immediate ground. On the island, the state recognized the drift and planned to show it. Announcements promised captured men would be fed, processed, and presented as proof of a repelled intrusion. The tone remained measured. There was no need for embellishment when routine could carry the point. For the men on the sand, routine was the enemy they could not outflank. Routine meant regular patrols arriving on schedule. Routine meant supply for the defenders reaching along safe corridors. Routine meant that every gap discovered in the morning would be patched by late day. The exiles' internal notes still recorded acts of steady courage, a team holding a corner until night, a pair carrying a third to safer ground, a small group refusing to abandon a post until ordered. These entries mattered to morale and memory. They did not shift the balance. As shadows lengthened, a rumor moved along the shore that a broader shield might yet be allowed. The rumor did not solidify. It was tested against the tempo of the radios and found wanting. A few officers pressed a case with calm voices and did not succeed. They then returned to the line and adjusted positions to stretch another hour. Somewhere inland, a clerk drafted a prisoner processing ledger listing columns for names, times, and locations. That ledger, if it survives, would be a cold index of the day's shape. It would also be one of the documents that later claims would point to as confirmation that the episode had moved from flux to control. Evening settled again. The surf softened. Fires were covered. Men lay down and kept their boots on. They slept by minutes, woke, and listened for instructions that did not come. The night did not break. It simply paused the movement of clocks and let smaller sounds come forward, the kind that tell a man whether he will need to run when the next hour opens. Near midnight, a short message reached a senior figure offshore, acknowledging the strain and noting that the window for any change would close with the next dawn. The reply did not promise a shift. It asked for patience. Patience, by then, had become a word that measured endurance rather than strategy. Shortly before first light, a runner delivered a list of positions to be held until noon, with contingencies for withdrawal if the ring tightened further. The instruction was thin but clear. It indicated that the day ahead would be defined by holding patterns and the careful movement of small groups toward points where extraction might still be feasible. Before the horizon turned gray, attention moved from the padded dark of the shoreline to the makeshift pens and interrogation rooms inland, where statements would be taken and exhibits laid out in orderly lines. By the fourth morning, the shape of the event had hardened. The beachhead had shrunk until it resembled a set of scattered pockets, each with its own small radius and its own calculation about whether to hold or drift. Some men surrendered when their water ran out and their lines cut off any hope of movement. Others moved into the scrub and waited for night that would bring only more waiting. A few tried for the water, misjudged currents, and were brought back by patrols who now knew the routes and the rhythms. Captivity did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a sequence. First came hands raised, then a walk along the sand, then a stop at a table where a name was recorded, then a transfer to a truck that turned inland. In those trucks, men stared at the floor and counted the seconds between bumps. The state had prepared spaces for intake. They were not elaborate. They were built to sort and to display. Processors asked the questions they had been given and wrote down answers in neat script. A clerk stamped each page and placed it into a folder. Somewhere nearby, exhibits were laid on tables, armbands, badges, and loose papers that would help tell a story to the home audience and to anyone beyond the island listening for cues. A brief internal circular from the capital emphasized 2 points. First, that the handling of prisoners should be orderly and documented. Second, that the documentation itself would be used to demonstrate outside interference and the island's discipline in response. That circular did not instruct cruelty. It instructed order. Order, in this case, was the weapon the state needed most. Outside the intake halls, the public face moved forward with posters and scheduled statements. A press event showed select items arranged in clean lines, and a spokesman used calm language to frame the episode as an attempted incursion defeated by vigilance. The goal was not merely to claim victory. It was to claim normalcy in the wake of threat. In neighborhoods, committees read lists and reminded residents of reporting channels. The island's leadership had learned that fear could be shaped into routine, and routine could be shown as proof of unity. For the exiles, the passage from freedom to confinement felt like the contraction of a map drawn in the mind. Each step tightened the edges of that map until it could be folded and put into a pocket that was not theirs. Interrogations varied in tone but shared a core. Identify yourself. State your route. Name your contacts. Many could not answer beyond the first, either because they did not know or because they judged silence to be a final act of agency. Some spoke in generalities that revealed little and cost little. A few said more than they intended, not from disloyalty, but from exhaustion. The paper trail that grew from these rooms became part of the event's second life. It would be cited, parsed, and arranged in ways that served a broader argument, and it would also be copied into files where it would sleep until someone needed it again. Beyond the island, discussions about response had largely closed. The imagined hinges had not turned. The lines drawn in earlier meetings held. A short memorandum, likely written near the end of the crisis cycle, observed that escalation would have breached a policy boundary that had been useful across other theaters. To preserve that boundary was to accept this loss in scale while avoiding a change in kind. The memorandum did not celebrate. It recorded, by the time the last groups on the sand laid down their arms, the outcome had become a pattern of facts that could not be rearranged without fiction. Ships pulled back to positions that signaled caution. Radios, once crowded with requests, settled into quiet checks and short acknowledgments. On the island, the state organized its conclusion, not as a single declaration, but as a series of acts meant to show continuity. Work resumed in plants, with supervisors reminding crews to report anything unusual. Schools distributed brief notices with generalized guidance. Civic groups appeared in squares with banners that used simple words about sovereignty and alertness. The episode was framed as both a test and a lesson. The state implied that those who doubted its strength should consider the speed of the response and the completeness of the paperwork. The exiles who now sat behind fence and wire carried another lesson. They learned how quickly a plan built on timing could fail when approvals did not align. They learned how silence from far away could weigh more than any signal. They learned that local sentiment, read through distance and hope, can be the least reliable compass. The memory of those days began to settle into two forms. One was the official story, polished, linear, and reinforced by exhibits and dates. The other was a quieter memory circulated among families, friends, and communities in exile, where details were retold and revised at kitchen tables and in small halls where lights were left on late. Neither memory fully captured the other. Both were selective because selection is inevitable when pain and pride share a page. Years later, scholars would look back at minutes, press files, and field notes to trace the chain of decisions that brought men to that beach and held others back from crossing a threshold. But inside the days themselves, the men did not live analysis. They lived minutes that could not be paused. They lived the weight of a canteen that felt too light, the scratch of a logbook, the calm voice of a clerk asking another question that sounded like the one before it. The island moved into a posture of watchfulness that would not relax quickly. The shoreline returned to its ordinary tasks, though those tasks now carried an echo. The sea, indifferent to maps and minutes, kept its own counsel and washed the traces it could touch. Near sunset on the final day, a senior official in the capital initialed a closing note on the operation, directing that a summary be prepared for release and that the next set of internal trainings include lessons learned about neighborhood coordination and rapid messaging. That administrative act, small on its face, signaled that the event had become a chapter inside a longer manual. It also suggested that the next scene would unfold in rooms where papers are sorted, files are labeled, and the conflict shifts from sand to narrative. With the shoreline quiet and the pens full, the thread moves toward the tables where reports will be compiled and the public account readied for the days ahead. When the last forms were stacked and the final statement drafted, the air in those rooms felt thinner, as if the building had exhaled. The island presented its account with practiced restraint, pointing to orderly intake logs and brief, dated announcements as the spine of its claim. Supporters repeated those lines with modest pride. Opponents reviewed the same papers and found spaces where silence seemed to speak. Outside the island, the episode entered conference rooms and footnotes. It became a case with bounded edges, a warning about timelines, and a study in how hopes can outrun approvals. The men who had stepped onto the sand now watched days through fences, their horizon narrowed to routines that did not belong to them. They passed the time by exchanging the small facts they could verify, building a shared memory that did not need a microphone. Those facts were plain and human. A name called, a cup passed, a list checked. In each, the scale of the gamble shrank to the size of a day. Yet, even as the story settled into pages, the larger shape of it remained unsettled. How much did caution preserve for a later contest? How much did it concede that would not be regained? Which notes in the files capture the true weight of the choice to hold a line? The shoreline cannot answer. The papers, even when precise, do not confess motive. They only tell us what was done and when. In that gap, meaning circulates and hardens by degrees. The beach that once felt like an opening is now a place where fishermen trade news and buses lift dust over the same packed road. Somewhere, a folder is placed back on a shelf and a light goes out in a room that still smells of ink. The next movement, if there is one, will start with another meeting, another agenda, and another set of names read aloud while the sea keeps its own time.